Hey everybody, Tim Albrecht here, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP segment of the Your Financial Pharmacist Podcast, where we feature questions from you, the YFP community, to be answered by one of YFP Planning's fee-only certified financial planners. Before we jump into today's question, I want to give a shout out to YFP Planning's team that makes this segment possible. YFP Planning offers fee-only comprehensive financial planning that is customized to the pharmacy professional. You can learn more and book a free discovery call by visiting yfpplanning.com. Again, that's yfpplanning.com. Okay, this week's question comes in from a webinar that we recently did. And the question is, what considerations should be made with regard to balancing loan repayment and home buying? Tim Baker, what are your thoughts?
I feel like this is probably one of the bigger or one of the more common questions that we get. And it's the answer can just vary, right? It depends. That's my stock answer. So I think that looking at this is harder than it was in the past because I think there's just so many more variables, Tim. Obviously, with Biden forgiveness, a lot of people have been storing away cash because of the deferment on the student loans and interest and all that kind of stuff. So people could be in a stronger cash position. But then obviously with those payments presumably coming back online the first of next year, you're potentially weighing a mortgage payment along with the student loan payment. Now, the good news for borrowers from that perspective is the payment should be more generous, read less of a percentage of income than previously student loan payback plans. But that's not to say the best route to go either, Tim, because typically you're going to do that if you're seeking some type of forgiveness, or you potentially would refi and pay it off somewhat more aggressively. So this all goes back to again, what does the balance sheet look like? What is the student loan strategy? So we always talk about you have to inventory the loans, which people I feel like for the most part have done a fairly good job of wrapping their head around what they actually owe, both on the federal and the private side. And then looking at all the strategies that are available, which are shifting because of the change in with the Biden update, and then optimize that. So it could very well be that in this particular case that a home purchase actually fits, right? Because if you are looking at a forgiveness option and you can lower that payment along with kind of shouldering the burden of like a monthly mortgage, it could work. And then if you look at potentially, if you assume that has been some stockpiling of cash during this deferment period, that might help your case too. The other thing you got to look at is interest rates. Now, some people think that interest rates are going to continue to climb. Some people think that we're kind of at its peak and they'll start coming down this year, and who knows? I've read kind of both sides of that argument. Is it the best time in terms of timing the interest rate, and how does that affect $400,000 home 2 years ago is going to look a lot different on your mortgage statement than a $400,000 home today, just because of the interest payments. So there's just a lot of moving pieces here, and I think I always go back to the balance sheet and I go back to the goals, right? So does it make sense to maybe wait and see come the new year, what everything shakes out to be with regard to the student loans? Maybe. But, as we know with the home purchase, Tim, is that it's such an emotional thing that if you're actively looking, everything kind of goes out the window, even the plan sometimes. So it's one of those decisions, home purchase and, the trajectory in which you want to take your loans, that's so big and it affects, now, but then, the orders of magnitude, 10, 20 years in the future are so big as well, as particularly with the student loans, that I think it's worth obviously talking to somebody and having someone, take an objective third-party look at the goals and the balance sheet and say, hey, this is what I think you should do. Because I think making these decisions, what should I do with the student loans versus what should I do with the home, purchase in a vacuum is not the right way. So it kind of goes back to my stock answer of it depends, which is super annoying. But, again, you're looking at, two major components of a financial plan that could greatly affect, your wealth, both today and in the future.
Yeah, Tim, we see the question come up a lot, and I think it's for good reason, right? When a pharmacist is looking at their budget and their take-home pay, typically student loans and then the mortgage payment, or perhaps if it's a rent payment now, eventually it'll be a mortgage payment. Those are probably the two biggest things, depending on, your student loan repayment strategy. So your point I thought was spot on in that, for folks that currently don't have a mortgage payment, so maybe this is a first-time home buyer and they haven't had to pay on student loans, Like if both of those turn back on in terms of the forbearance ending, come January 2023, and then obviously if somebody buys a home and that mortgage payment starts, that could be fairly abrupt. And so taking a step back, running the budget, and as you mentioned, making sure we lock down what is our student loan repayment strategy and what is that dollar amount in the budget projected to be. Because as we've talked about on this show over and over again, depending on your strategy, loan forgiveness, non-forgiveness, income driven repayment, standard repayment, that could be the difference of, who knows, $1,000 a month, depending on the strategy that you go and the amount of debt that you have. So run the budget, look at the goals, take a step back. As you mentioned, don't look at it in a silo. And how do you feel about the math? And then from there, that's going to help inform the budget on the home purchase. What's the down payment look like? What's the lending options look like? But so important, as you highlighted, make sure we're not looking at this in a silo for sure. We do have actually a blog post on this topic specifically. Nate Hedrick, the real estate RPH, we have featured him on the podcast several times. We have a post that he wrote a couple years ago, 3 strategies for buying a house with student loans. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last couple of years around both student loans and the home buying market, but I think that piece of content is still really relevant, and we'll link to that in the show notes. For those that are listening and you'd like to have your question featured on an upcoming episode, you can shoot us an email, info@yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You can also record your question by visiting yourfinancialpharmacist.com/ask-YFP. As we wrap up this week's episode of the Ask a YFP CFP, an important reminder that the content in this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. For more information on that, you can visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thanks for listening and have a great rest of your week.